In the solitude of the morgue, where silence reigns supreme, strange and unexplainable things happen. A flicker of light in the corner of your eye, a faint sound echoing where no one should be. Have you ever wondered what secrets these cold, lifeless rooms hold? Tonight, we're diving into the unsettling tales of what goes on where the living fear to tread. Are you ready to hear the stories that no one dares to speak aloud? Throughout history, the morgue has been a place shrouded in mystery. It's where life meets its end, and yet, some say it's where something else begins. Tonight, I will share with you 4 chilling stories from morgues around the world. Tales told by those who worked there, who lived to share their experiences. What they encountered will make you question what truly lingers in the quiet corners of these halls. But stay with me until the very end. Why? Because the final story is unlike anything you've ever heard before. It's the kind of tale that stays with you, long after the lights go out, changing the way you'll see these places forever. Are you brave enough to face it? Grab a blanket, turn off the lights, and settle in for a journey into the darkest corners of human experience. These are not just stories, they are warnings. Warnings of what happens when the silence of the morgue is broken. So, will you listen, or will you turn away before it's too late? Story 1. Nina had always been drawn to the quiet intensity of night shifts. The stillness of the hospital at night offered her a strange kind of solace, a place where she could focus entirely on her patients without the chaos of the day. But the morgue was different. It wasn't a place she entered often, nor one she particularly liked. It was cold, dimly lit, and carried an unshakable weight in the air, as if the walls themselves absorbed the sorrow of the lives that had ended there. On this particular night, a storm raged outside, the wind howling against the windows, rattling them as if trying to break in. The power flickered occasionally, but the hospital's backup generators ensured that essential systems kept running. Nina was making her rounds when the call came through. A body needed to be transferred from one section of the morgue to another for an autopsy scheduled early the next morning. The usual staff responsible for such tasks were unavailable, and so the duty fell to her. Reluctantly, she made her way to the basement. The elevator ride down felt longer than usual, the metallic groan of the cables echoing in the confined space. When the doors opened, the air felt colder than she remembered, as though the chill had seeped into her bones. The dim lighting cast long shadows on the walls, shadows that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. As she entered the morgue, the fluorescent lights above flickered, humming faintly before stabilizing. She found the body she needed to move and began preparing the gurney. That was when she heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder. She stopped what she was doing, holding her breath to listen more closely. The sound seemed to be coming from the far end of the room, where a row of lockers used to store personal effects stood. "Nina, it's just the storm," she muttered to herself, forcing a nervous chuckle. But the tapping continued, steady and deliberate. Summoning her courage, she walked toward the lockers, her footsteps echoing on the polished floor. As she got closer, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, amplifying the rapid beating of her heart. She reached out to open one of the locker doors when, from the corner of her eye, she saw movement. It was a shadow, darker than the others, shifting unnaturally along the far wall. Her hand froze midair, and a chill ran down her spine. She turned quickly, her eyes scanning the room, but there was nothing there. Telling herself it was her imagination, she returned to the gurney and began the transfer. But the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Every few seconds, she would glance over her shoulder, expecting to see someone, or something, standing there. The air felt heavier now, oppressive, as if the room itself were closing in on her. As she wheeled the body toward the exit, the overhead lights flickered violently, plunging the room into brief moments of darkness. It was in one of these moments that she saw it. A figure, tall and thin, standing in the corner of the room. Its form was indistinct, almost blending with the shadows, but its presence was undeniable. Her breath caught in her throat as the lights came back on, and the figure was gone. Nina's hands trembled as she pushed the gurney faster, her footsteps hurried and uneven. The tapping sound resumed, now louder and erratic, echoing from all directions. She reached the door, fumbling with the handle. When she felt it, a light, icy touch on her shoulder. She spun around, but the room was empty. Her heart raced as she threw the door open and pushed the gurney out into the hallway. The lights here were steady, and the familiar hum of the hospital's machinery offered a fleeting sense of normalcy. But when she turned back to close the door, she saw them. Shadows moving against the walls, twisting and contorting unnaturally, as if reaching for her. Without thinking, she slammed the door shut and ran, leaving the gurney behind. When she finally reached the safety of the nurse's station, her colleagues noticed her pale face and trembling hands. "Are you okay?" one of them asked, concern evident in her voice. Nina wanted to explain, but how could she? What could she say that wouldn't make her sound crazy? Over the next few nights, she avoided the morgue entirely, delegating any tasks involving it to others. But the experience stayed with her. She couldn't shake the feeling of those shadows, the way they seemed alive, watching her, waiting. And then, a week later, she overheard a conversation between two custodians. "Did you hear about the morgue?" one of them asked. "Apparently, a worker quit last week. Said he saw something down there. Shadows, or figures, or something." The other custodian laughed nervously. "Yeah, I heard. They say it's haunted. Too many restless souls in one place. You know." Nina didn't join the conversation, but her hands tightened around the chart she was holding. Restless souls. It wasn't a comforting thought, but it felt like an explanation. Yet deep down, she wondered if it was something worse. Something that didn't belong to the living or the dead. Something that thrived in the silence of the morgue. And she prayed she would never have to go back to find out. Story 2. The new night shift nurse, Clara, was known for her unwavering composure. She had worked in several hospitals, handling emergencies and crises without breaking a sweat. When she transferred to the hospital, the morgue's reputation as a place of unease didn't faze her. Clara brushed off the whispers of her colleagues, chalking them up to overactive imaginations or tales meant to scare the new staff. It was during her second week that she met Dr. Perez, the hospital's senior pathologist. He had been working in the morgue for over 2 decades and was known for his calm demeanor and meticulous work. They crossed paths during her rounds, and he offered her a cup of coffee in the break room. While they chatted, she asked him about the rumors surrounding the morgue. Dr. Perez smiled, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. "The morgue has its quirks," he said. "I've seen things I can't explain, but I've learned not to question too much. It's best to keep your head down, do your job, and leave the rest alone." Clara raised an eyebrow, intrigued by his cryptic response. "Like what?" she pressed. He hesitated before answering. "Shadows, movements in the corners of my vision, and sometimes sounds that have no source." His tone was calm, but Clara noticed he avoided meeting her gaze. That night, Clara's curiosity got the better of her. She volunteered to help with a task that required retrieving a file from the morgue storage area. The morgue was eerily silent as she entered, the only sound coming from the hum of the refrigeration units. The air was colder than usual, biting against her skin. As she made her way down the rows of storage lockers, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, casting long, stark shadows across the room. Clara focused on the task at hand, scanning the labels on the lockers for the file she needed. It wasn't until she bent down to open a drawer that she noticed it, a faint shadow moving along the far wall. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The movement was subtle, but it was there, distinct against the sterile white tiles. She turned quickly, expecting to see a coworker or perhaps a trick of the light, but the room was empty. Clara tried to shake off her unease, but the shadow lingered in her mind. She grabbed the file and stood up, ready to leave, when the lights flickered. The buzzing grew louder, almost aggressive, and for a brief moment, the room was plunged into darkness. When the lights came back on, she saw it, a figure standing at the end of the row. It wasn't solid, more like a mass of darkness shaped vaguely like a person. It didn't move, but Clara felt its gaze, cold and piercing. She blinked, and the figure was gone. Her heart raced as she backed away, clutching the file tightly. She turned to leave, but the shadows on the walls seemed to ripple and shift as if alive. Her footsteps echoed in the silent room, but with each step, she heard another sound, softer, lighter, but perfectly synchronized with hers. Someone, or something, was following her. Clara reached the door and pushed it open with trembling hands. The hallway outside was bright and warm, a stark contrast to the oppressive atmosphere of the morgue. She hurried back to the nurse's station, her mind racing. She wanted to tell someone, but who would believe her? Shadows that moved? Figures that vanished? It sounded absurd, even to her. The next day, Clara couldn't stop thinking about the encounter. She sought out Dr. Perez, hoping for an explanation or at least some reassurance. When she found him in his office, she recounted her experience. He listened intently, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. "You're not the first to see something like that," he admitted. "There's a reason why people don't stay on the night shift for long. It's not just the work, it's the things we can't explain." Clara pressed him for more details, but he simply shook his head. "All I'll say is this, don't look too closely. Sometimes, the shadows look back." Clara left his office with more questions than answers. Over the next few weeks, she tried to avoid the morgue, but her curiosity kept pulling her back. Each time she entered, the air felt heavier, the shadows darker. She began to notice little things, doors that creaked open on their own, faint whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. The shadows were always there, shifting just out of sight. One night, Clara decided to stay late and observe. She sat quietly in the corner of the morgue, her eyes scanning the room. Hours passed without incident, and she began to feel foolish. Maybe it was all in her head. But as the clock struck 3, the temperature in the room dropped sharply. The shadows on the walls began to move, writhing like living things. In the corner of the room, the dark figure appeared again, its presence more menacing than before. Clara's chest tightened as she realized it wasn't alone. More figures emerged from the shadows, their forms indistinct but undeniably there. They surrounded her, silent and still, as if waiting for something. Clara bolted for the door, her pulse pounding in her ears. She didn't look back, afraid of what she might see. When she reached the hallway, she collapsed against the wall, gasping for air. The lights in the morgue flickered one last time before stabilizing, as if mocking her. She never spoke of what she saw that night, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows were still watching her, waiting for her to return. Even now, she avoids walking past the morgue, her footsteps quickening as she feels the weight of unseen eyes. Whatever lurks in the shadows, she knows one thing for certain: it isn't finished with her. Story 3. The morgue was unusually quiet that night, even for a place where silence reigned supreme. Grace, the night shift supervisor, had worked in the hospital for over a decade and prided herself on her attention to detail. The unyielding routine of cataloging bodies, signing forms, and ensuring that every step of the process was followed brought her a strange sense of comfort. But that night, something felt off. It started with a routine delivery. A middle-aged man, the victim of a sudden heart attack, had been brought in earlier in the evening. The paramedics had logged his arrival, and Grace had personally ensured the transfer to locker B17. She remembered it clearly: the man's pale features, the stark contrast of his dark suit against the white sheet, and the weight of the gurney as she helped slide him into the cold storage unit. Nothing about the process had been unusual. Until she opened the locker, the request had come from the pathology department. The body was scheduled for an early morning autopsy, and Grace was tasked with moving it to the preparation area. But when she pulled open the drawer, it was empty. Her first thought was a mistake. Perhaps the body had been misplaced or incorrectly logged. She checked the records, scanning every entry meticulously. The name, the time of arrival, and the assigned locker number were all correct. B17. Frowning, she closed the drawer and opened the neighboring ones, thinking perhaps the body had been shifted by someone else. One by one, the cold steel drawers revealed their contents, some occupied, others empty, but the man was nowhere to be found. Grace's unease grew as she called the other night staff, her voice trembling slightly despite her attempts to stay calm. The security officer on duty joined her, his flashlight casting long, eerie shadows as they searched every corner of the morgue. The room was sterile, orderly, and devoid of any sign that the body had ever been there. The security footage was the next logical step. Together, they reviewed the tapes from the moment the body had been delivered. The grainy black and white footage showed everything clearly. The paramedics wheeling the gurney in, Grace signing the paperwork, and the body being placed in locker B17. Hours passed on the recording without incident. No one entered the morgue, and no one left. Yet somehow, the body was gone. By now, the tension in the air was palpable. Grace felt her pulse quicken as she considered the possibilities. Had someone tampered with the footage? But why? And how would they have removed the body without leaving any trace? She couldn't shake the feeling that something larger was at play, something she couldn't explain. Determined to get answers, Grace decided to stay in the morgue for the rest of the night, watching over the remaining bodies. The room felt colder than usual, the fluorescent lights casting a sickly glow over the steel drawers. She sat at her desk, the hum of the refrigeration units the only sound breaking the silence. Every creak of the building made her flinch, her imagination conjuring images of shadows moving just out of sight. Around 3 a.m., the temperature seemed to drop even further, the chill biting through her sweater. She rubbed her hands together, glancing at the thermostat, which read an impossibly low number. She stood to adjust it when a soft thud echoed from the far end of the room. Freezing in place, she turned toward the source of the sound. One of the drawers was slightly ajar. Her breath hitched as she approached it, her footsteps hesitant and slow. The drawer belonged to a different body, logged earlier that day. She hadn't opened it since, and yet here it was, pulled open by a few inches. She hesitated before gripping the handle and sliding it out completely. The body inside was untouched, its pale features serene beneath the white sheet. But something was wrong. The air around it felt heavy, almost oppressive, and the faintest scent of something metallic hung in the air. Grace pushed the drawer back in, her heart pounding in her chest. As she turned to leave, she heard another sound, a faint whisper, too soft to make out the words but unmistakably human. She spun around, her eyes scanning the room, but it was empty. The whispering grew louder, echoing from all directions. It wasn't a single voice but many, overlapping and chaotic, as though the room itself was alive with unseen presences. Then, the lights flickered. In the brief moments of darkness, Grace saw something she couldn't comprehend, a shadow, darker than the room's natural dimness, moving across the wall. It wasn't human, its form shifting and amorphous, yet it radiated a sense of malice that made her blood run cold. When the lights stabilized, the room was still again, but the oppressive feeling remained. Grace backed away toward the door, her instincts screaming at her to leave. As she reached for the handle, a loud crash reverberated through the room. One of the drawers had been flung open, its contents spilling onto the floor. But it wasn't the body she had expected. It was the man from B-17. His body lay crumpled on the cold tile, his face twisted in an expression of sheer terror. His fingers were curled, as though he had been clawing at something. But that wasn't the worst part. His eyes were open, staring blankly at the ceiling, and his mouth was frozen mid-scream. Grace's mind raced as she struggled to make sense of what she was seeing. The man's body showed no signs of physical harm, no wounds or marks that could explain his state. It was as if he had died again, but this time, from pure, unrelenting fear. Shaking, she called for help. When the other staff arrived, the body was examined and the area thoroughly searched, but no evidence was found to explain what had happened. The security footage from that night revealed nothing unusual, as though the events she had experienced had never occurred. In the days that followed, rumors spread among the staff. Some claimed the man had been cursed, his soul never truly at rest. Others whispered about the morgue itself, suggesting it was a place where the veil between worlds was dangerously thin. Grace didn't know what to believe, but she couldn't forget the look on the man's face or the feeling of something watching her in that room. She transferred to a day shift shortly after, unable to face the morgue again. But even in the light of day, she couldn't shake the lingering sense of dread. What had taken the man from Locker B-17? And more importantly, was it still there, waiting for its next victim? The question haunted her, a reminder that some mysteries were better left unsolved. Each of these stories serves as a chilling reminder that there are places where mystery and death intertwine, where the boundaries between the living and the unknown blur in unsettling ways. Would you dare to work in a place like this, knowing what might happen? Could you face the silence, the shadows, and the unexplainable events that lurk in the corners? If these stories sent shivers down your spine, don't forget to subscribe and share them with someone brave enough to listen. Who knows? Maybe they'll have a story of their own to tell.